I'm going to replace the charging system on this 1983 R100RS, and I decided to go with the MotoElectrics Enduralast Type 3 charging system. It puts out 400 watts, which is a nice boost over the stock 240, and I'm planning to do some winter riding, so I'm installing heated grips and would like to use a heated vest, so this should meet that load. The kit comes with a new stator coil and also with a new rotor, and the rotor comes with a protective cap over the slip rings. There's also a brand new electronic voltage regulator which is adjustable, and a new diode board to handle the higher output. The diode board also comes with a set of metal mounts. BMW originally put rubber mounts on this bike for the diode board, and they have a habit of failing, and that can let the diode board fall into the case and short out. I've already changed out my rubber mounts because they had failed, but the kit gives you a brand new set of metal mounts. There's also 2 new brushes for the alternator and a set of wires. These are the 3 wires that go between the alternator and the diode board. Since the alternator is 3-phase, there's 1 wire for each phase. And there's a center tap on the alternator known as the Y wire. And so there's this wire, and it connects between the alternator and the diode board. And there's the battery plus output off the diode board, or the B plus output. So there's a new wire for that. That goes from the diode board to the ring terminal on the starter solenoid, and a couple of extra ground wires, and some dielectric grease for keeping corrosion away from all the electrical connections. So a very complete kit. I also decided to replace the stator cover with a completely new one from MotoElectrics. This cover comes fully assembled with a new set of brush holders and brushes, and these are the brushes that don't require solder. They have a ring terminal on the end that you can remove very easily, so changing these when they wear out is no longer requiring me to do any soldering. And all of the other hardware for the other terminals is all included on the cover. What I found nice about this is that BMW doesn't sell this cover separately anymore, but you can buy all the little bits of hardware, and the only way to get a new cover from BMW is to buy a whole new alternator. In this case, the total cost of this is less than what BMW would charge you for the brush holder. So I think this is a really nice value. And I'm going to use some new Allen bolts to mount the cover and stator to the engine block. I'm going to replace the voltage regulator sub-harness, so I picked up a kit for the R80 that contains that cable. It's the same cable as for the R100. There are some other wires in the kit that are used for connecting the diode board to the alternator. I decided to use the B plus cable from this kit rather than the one included in the Type 3 charging system kit. I'm also going to replace some of the wiring in the engine. This is the wiring harness that goes to the voltage regulator, and this is the harness that goes to the battery plus terminal and connects to the ring terminal on the starter solenoid. All of this is time to replace these based on the age of the bike. So I'm going to install the stator cover onto the stator windings. You'll notice there's a set of wires here. This is the Y wire, or the center tap, and these are the wires for the 3 phases. Now, the phase wires have a slidable insulation. You can move it up and down the wire a little bit. And what I've done is pull it up about like that, so that there's going to be plenty of insulation up toward the end of the wire here. You'll see in a minute why that matters. Now, the Y terminal here is going to come through this hole and bend over and go on to this screw terminal. And I take the nut off, and then there's a lock washer under the nut and a terminal for connecting the other end of the Y connector to the diode board. Now, this is a bolt and a lock nut, so I tighten that up so it's good and snug, because when I tighten up the nut on top of the Y terminal, I don't want this to spin in the cover. Now, the 3-phase wires are going to come through this hole, and then they'll bend down and go into these slots. There's no order. It doesn't matter which wire goes in which slot, but I usually arrange them so that they go in this order, which is the way they're coming up off the coil, just because it puts less of a kink in the wire. So the process is just to slide the Y terminal through its hole and then twist that a little, and there we go. Now, there's one other thing to keep in mind, and that is that there's 3 holes in the stator cover, and there are correspondingly 3 grooves here. So you're going to want to twist the cover a little bit to be sure that you will be able to put the bolt through the hole in the cover, and it's going to line up with one of the slots in the edge of the stator windings. So that kind of sets everything up. Now, I can put this Y terminal onto the post, just bend it over. Now, first off, I need to put the metal terminal tab on, then put the ring over, and then the lock washer, and then the nut. And then I'll tighten that up good and snug so it won't go anywhere. Now, over here, these are the 3 wires, and I find that if I just take my needle nose pliers and put a kink in them and lay them down in each of the terminal slots, you can see now why I wanted to have some insulation available to me, because I want that insulation when I solder these to be very close to the terminal that they solder into, to prevent any possibility of a short. So they're going to go in somewhat similar to this, and then I'll solder each of the 3. So that's the process for installing the cover onto the stator windings. So I've got my soldering gun good and hot, and I'm soldering the terminals. And I'll let that dry, and then I'll take some diagonal cutters and cut off the ends, and they'll be all soldered. And I just bring them right up to the edge there and snip them off. This bike has a special ground wire octopus, and your bike likely won't have this. In any event, you should install 2 ground wires under 2 of the diode board studs to ensure the diode board has a good ground. I'm mounting some extra ground wires underneath the studs that hold the diode board to the inner timing cover. The bike came with what I'll call an octopus ground wire system. There's a big lug here that goes up under the bolt that holds the bracket for the starter motor. And then there's a leg here that's going to go up here underneath the stud, so it slides right through like that. And I've already got one of those installed over here. So these two are part of the octopus. They get grounded into here, and there's another lug on the octopus that'll fit here. Now there were some shorter ground wires, and I'm going to put them on the bottom studs and stick them here as well. So the other one will come in like this. This gives a lot of ground paths, which I think is not a bad idea. So I have all the ground wires installed. This is that big lug for the octopus, and this is a leg of the octopus and one over here, and the third one on this bolt here, and then the two short wires come in to the bolt here. Now that I have the 4 diode board studs mounted, I want to check to be sure the diode board will slide easily onto the studs. And in this case, that's what you want, a nice easy slip fit. There's enough free play between the hole and the stud threads that you can get them enough off center that you can't quite line up the diode board. So if that's the case, loosen them up a little and adjust them. Before I mount the diode board, I'm going to install the voltage regulator wiring harness. It has a rubber grommet with a curved nose on it that fits up in the slot at the top of the inner timing cover. And then that's the connector that goes on to the voltage regulator. And there's another connector that goes to another connector on the bike. There's a detail I want to show you on this grommet for the voltage regulator. It's the 2-hole version of this grommet, which is the only one that's available anymore. And so that hole is open, but I don't want it to be a path for water to get inside the timing cover. So I filled it with some black RTV and let it set up overnight. Now this black wire is actually going to go back in through here because it connects to the starter solenoid on a terminal. And it's the spade terminal on the starter solenoid that this plugs into. The thing to be careful about is that there's the crankcase rebreather line. I like to bring the wire up under that and then onto the spade terminal. That way it won't chafe on this hose, which is a good idea. Now, the black wire is going to the spade terminal on the starter solenoid. The blue wire is going to go on the back of the diode board. And then these are the 2 wires that are going to go onto the brush terminals. I don't want this wire sitting back behind the diode board, so I'm going to route it behind this web to get it behind the diode board and out of the way. And that's a safer place for it to live. So I'm just going to pull it around and slide the grommet back in and get my blue wire back where I want it. So it's over here, right where the terminals are going to be on the stator. Now, the back of the diode board has a D+ terminal, which is what the blue wire is going to go on. Before I put the wire on, I use some dielectric grease. There's a little container of it in the kit I bought for the alternator, but I have a industrial supply of it that I picked up a while ago. So I'm going to use that and put a little on the spade and then slide the terminal on, and then that just sits on the 4 studs. And to hold it on, there is a flat washer and a lock nut. So they just pop on the terminal stud like that, and then I'll just spin them all on and then tighten that all up, and I'll have the diode board installed. I had a piece of masking tape on the taper of the crankshaft nose to protect it from some cycle work tools I was using. So that's going to leave behind some glue on that taper, and I need the taper to be absolutely clean. So I put a little bit of lacquer thinner and wiped the nose, got everything off of it, and then finished up with an alcohol pad to make sure there's no oil or anything, not even fingerprints on that taper. And then I did the same thing in the new rotor taper. I cleaned it out with lacquer thinner on a rag or a blue shop towel, and then used another alcohol wipe to clean that out again. So I'm ready to install the rotor on the nose, but before I did that, I used metal polish to just clean the slip rings and get them nice and shiny. And the other thing I did, because this is going to slide, this face here on the rotor is going to slide through the front main seal, I put a little bit of oil on the outside, being very careful not to get any on the inside of the taper. So when I slide it on, it won't be so rough on that seal. Now, the trick is just to push it on like that. And then what I like to do is take a rubber mallet and right on the nose, tap it a couple of times. Now, if there's no oil and the interference fits are working properly, I should not be able to spin it. But as you can see, I'm spinning the rotor, so it's not clean. So I went to my old standby of brake cleaner, and I cleaned the nose and the taper inside the rotor. Then I put it on and tapped it again, and I'm actually turning the crankshaft, which is exactly what I want to have happen. That means the taper is as tight as it can be and there's no oil. So all that's left to do is run in the bolt here, and there's two sets of threads. So you'll get through one set and then it'll pop a little like that, and then we'll get to the second set, and then I'll snug it up and torque it. So I'm going to torque this bolt to 14 foot-pounds, which is a pretty low setting. So I'm going to use my inch-pound wrench and torque it to 170 inch, not foot, inch-pounds. What I like to use is an oil strap wrench that I can grab the outside of the rotor, and then I can get the torque wrench on and I can torque it up without the engine spinning. And there you go. So I'm ready to install the stator and stator cover. But before I did that, and actually before I even installed the rotor, I used a small file and I dressed the edges here of the sleeves that the stator housing slides into, because often right at the edge is a bit of a burr, and getting rid of that will let that housing slide easily. The other thing I did is took a little 600 grit wet dry and cleaned the slots on all three of these faces. I got rid of a little bit of garbage that was in there, and again just smoothed everything up so that the housing will slide. And it's this edge here that's going to slide into that sleeve. So I want it to be an easy slip fit. The other thing you need to do is pull the springs here and the second one in here so they sit on the top of the spring holder so that the brushes will retract. Because when I slide this onto the rotor, the brushes are going to slide across the slip rings, and if the springs are on them, it's hard for that to happen and you'll likely damage the brush. So pulling the retaining springs up and out so they rest on the edge solves that problem. The other thing I check is to be sure my holes in the cover are lining up with the grooves in the sleeve. And then the only other thing to be careful of as you put this in is that you don't want to catch the windings on the edge of the rotor when you slide it. But there's this inner set of metal rings inside that should protect you as long as you just go in straight. So it's just kind of like this. And I may have to push the brush up just a little bit to get it to slide up and over the slip ring. And then I rotate the sleeve until the grooves line up with the bolt holes. And then I have a bolt with wave washer, 3 of them, that should slide right in. And they ought to turn easily into the 3 bolt holes. And they will do that if you have everything lined up. If it's not lined up because you feel that one of the bolts is binding, then just go ahead and jiggle everything a little bit until you got it there. Now I use a little Allen socket, and I've snugged all 3 bolts down, and I ought to be able to just walk my way around the face, give it about a 1/4 to a 1/2 turn, and it ought to just keep sliding the sleeve into the groove in the face of the inner timing cover. And you can keep an eye on it to be sure everything's moving evenly across all 3 bolts. And eventually what you'll find is that they'll snug right up. Like that one's nice and snug now. And that one's nice and snug. And that one's snug. So again, I just do a visual inspection all the way around, and the little red band should be right up against the edge of the sleeve in the inner timing cover on all 3 of those sleeves. Now that I have the bolts snug against the cover, I'll use a little screwdriver and just slide my clips back onto the brushes so that they're riding on the slip rings. And when I snug these, I don't get very hard. These are very small bolts and not very big holes, so you don't want to get ruthless. It just needs to be good and tight. About like that. I'm not putting very much force on my wrench. I'm way back here and choking up on it. So that should be sufficient to hold the whole stator assembly together. I'm going to install the wire that goes from the diode board to the threaded terminal on the starter solenoid. It carries the DC output from the board, and it's what charges the battery. So sometimes it's called a B+ wire. Now it has a ring terminal on this end, and I bent that to a 90-degree angle, and why I did that will become clear in a minute. And then the other the other end is a spade terminal that fits on the output terminal on the diode board. Things are a little crowded in here because this is the crankcase rebreather hose, and you've got a little bit of clearance. So what I find is if I take this and slide it over the crankcase breather hose, so it's like that. Whoops, gotta have it backwards. Let's try that again. That's the end I want to go through this hole down here. So slide it over the rebreather hose, and then I can put the ring terminal on the threaded terminal on the starter solenoid, and I can take the other end and slide it through this hole in the front of the inner timing cover. And pretty much that's got things routed. I'll show you how that looks on the starter solenoid in just a second here. So this is the threaded terminal on the starter solenoid, and the 90-degree bend goes to the bottom like this. So that gives some clearance for the wire and keeps it off the hose clamp, which you can't quite see, but there's a hose clamp here for the rebreather hose. So I don't want this to touch that hose clamp and chafe. Now the other thing that goes on there is the end of the battery plus cable. So that slides onto the same terminal. And then there's a lock washer that goes on. And then there's a nut that goes on. So that's gonna be the installation for that B plus wire from the diode board. So on the battery plus wire, after it comes off the terminal on the starter solenoid, you kind of need to do a little bit of a loop because it's going to come up through the inner timing cover on the back hole, and there's a grommet that I will put in there, but it kind of has to take a loop like that so it's lined up with that hole that'll be in the grommet when I install it. Before I install all the wiring on the spade terminals, I use my dielectric grease, and I put a little on all the terminals here on the diode board. And this is the connector from the B plus wire off the starter solenoid screw terminal. That goes on this really big fat terminal here. So I put some on there, and then there's some here for the rotor brushes, and also here for the Y terminal cable. One other thing I like to do is test fit all the wires and make sure that the spade terminals feel pretty tight when I try to pull them off. Sometimes they're a little bit loose, and if that's the case, I'll use my skinny needle nose pliers and I'll reach inside the plastic protector, butt up against the edge of the spade terminal, and just roll it down a little further to tighten it up. So then I'm sure that all of my spade connectors are going to be nice and tight. So the process here is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to slide the B plus up onto that terminal, and then this is the Y wire, and that's the Y terminal on the diode board. So it's going to slide on, and then the other end goes on the Y terminal on the stator cover. So I've got that connected. Then there's the 3-phase wires, and those will go on up here. Now they can go on in any order, it does not matter. So I'll just slide them all on, and then they go on the other end down here, which interestingly enough, I forgot to put a little bit of the dielectric grease on them, so I will get that now. And then they slide over the terminals like that. There we go. And the last one here, sometimes I have to use my needle nose just to grab the end and get a grip on it and slide it. There we go. So that one was fighting me. Okay, now what I want is this bundle of phase wires to be back out of the way, this way, and then I can put the 2 wires that go on the brushes. Now one's black and one's brown. Brown is the ground. This terminal is D minus, so the brown goes on that, meaning ground, and this is DF, which is where the black wire goes. So it goes on like that. So all the wiring is installed on the charging system, and we finished the installation.